a speaker I've been really delighted could join us, and I'm looking forward to hearing from as well. So we're going to hear a little bit about modular and offsite. Mark Farmer, nice to see you. It's over to you.
Thank you, Richard, and good morning, everyone. So I'm just going to see if I can share my screen. Hopefully you can all see the presentation. So yeah, the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to give you a fairly rapid fire run through of my views on how the industry is faring in response to my 2016 challenge to modernise or die. And in particular, to look at some of those new drivers for change that the industry is now facing, which in some ways represent more challenges, in other ways actually represent accelerative opportunities, and clearly to talk a bit about MMC, modular, all the things that Richard just mentioned. So I'll start just perhaps with a brief recap as to what I said back in 2016. So I'm not going to rehearse some of these 10 symptoms of failure that I identified back in my report. They're pretty depressing reading, but they're all very well recognized and have been covered many times before. I think what's probably more important, though, is understanding the root cause of why we've got the industry we've got. And, you know, if you do a root cause analysis, one of the big issues that I picked up in my report was a fact that the industry had shaped itself to be resilient in the face of highly cyclical workload, a real boom bust approach to the commissioning of capex sensitive development across either public infrastructure or private development, which means that it's actually formed itself into a structure and shape which is inherently about being able to be flexible. One of my observations was that flexibility, that resilience is declining, and that declining structural resilience is probably best shows construction employment as a percentage of total employment over the last 40 odd years. And what you see is the sort of the economic cycles we've had in terms of recessions and recovery periods over that period of time. But what's really telling is that actually after each recession, and we have a growth period, the ability of the industry to expand again and to gain its original shape, that resiliency, has gradually come under more and more pressure until in the last cycle between the global financial crisis and where we are now, we actually saw the industry fail to achieve the peak employment percentages that it had in the previous boom period. So we're seeing something quite insidious creep over our industry, and it's also showing in this graph where you see construction employment as a percentage of total employment, again following the economic cycles, boom and bust. But what is worrying is the red lines, which are the recessionary decontraction lines, are getting steeper and steeper. So you have this asymmetric construction labor cycle. So the whole idea of shedding labor, it's very easy for an industry to shed labor in a downturn. And who knows what that might mean in the current COVID crisis. It's more and more difficult for the industry to regain its shape and its size. And that's shown by the green lines increasingly getting shallower and shallower as we go to the right. And that in itself should be concerning. It should be concerning to the industry in relation to its structural labour resource needs and its ability to resource the requirements of the industry moving ahead. But then if you overlay on that the risks around Brexit, and the whole scenario around Brexit, whether it's a no deal or not, has clearly got ramifications on the construction industry's dependency in certain parts of the country, at least on EU labour. And we're going to see a further tightening of access to EU labour under the new system. And it also has implications in terms of our supply chains. Our materials supply chains are inherently reliant on imported goods and materials, and that reliance has grown over the last 5 to 10 years. So you know, the threat of a no-deal Brexit adds a spectre of tariffs, and not just that, logistical barriers and interruptions in terms of the flow of materials to construction sites. So all of that wouldn't be as dramatic or as important for the industry if it wasn't for this inherent issue we have around productivity or lack of. So even though productivity fluctuates, and this graph shows in the micro detail that it does actually fluctuate within years, the bottom line is that we have flat line productivity growth. So it's oscillating around zero, and we haven't been able as an industry to actually move away from this site labor intensive model. It's all about retaining access to labor, dragging people onto sites when we need them. And when we do that in expansion periods, in growth periods, we stand a real risk of diluting competency and actually having issues around skills, which is probably what we've seen in the last cycle. And now, on top of all of that, we have the issue around COVID-19. So back in March, when we had the original lockdown, the industry ground to a halt. It then went back to work, but realized that actually that wasn't safe from a public health perspective. There was a lot of negative press headlines around the industry. It then got its act together around protocols and worked out what safe working looks like for a construction site, aided by CLC and Build UK interventions in that regard. But the upshot of that is the labour intensity that we've relied on so much as an industry is now really being shown to be an Achilles heel for the delivery mechanism. So the fact that we're able to put less labour on site is a real worry in terms of being able to deliver output. So even though we might have individual productivity on construction sites going up, because some workers are actually able to get on with their work unimpeded and without the threat of other trades trampling on their work or damaging their work or impeding access, total output in construction is down, and it will continue to be down as long as we have this restriction on site labour intensity. And then, if that wasn't enough, we're already starting to show signs that we're going back to our old ways, the behavioural flaws that we've shown in every economic cycle. When things get tough, the model that we deploy, which for construction and contracting is primarily a revenue-based cash flow model, leads us to go after the work at any cost. And at a time when margins are under pressure, and actually even in a boom period where the industry's been unable to make money, and we're now entering a deflationary period and depression potentially in construction work, that is a double whammy risk that the industry needs to be very wary of, and clients need to be wary of, consultants and advisors need to be wary of, and not actually contribute further to that fragility and that issue. But it starts with leadership from businesses avoiding that race to the bottom that we see every time. And these symptoms of failure that I started my presentation with, they're showing themselves and have been showing themselves now in a way that perhaps we haven't seen before. I work primarily in the residential sector, in apartment and house building, and the headlines we've seen over the last period of time have been pretty depressing around build quality. And that plethora of headlines is directly linked to this issue around skills and resiliency and lack of resiliency at the end of the day, because what's happening is more and more mistakes are being made. The competencies and skills that we're reliant on are getting stretched, and we're exposing ourselves to risk of failure at all stages of the process, from client commissioning to procurement, design, all the way through to construction on site. So with that as a backdrop, I thought it would just be worth rehearsing for a few minutes what is effectively a double-edged sword here. We have both a threat and an opportunity. And I like to use this graphic, which is quite stark. It's a Cabinet Office assessment of government programmes, which looked at the value add analysis in the cost of a construction project for government. And what this shows is that actually only 51 pence in the pound was actually going towards adding value. 49% of the entire construction project was non-value add, whether that's waste, whether it's transactional costs, whether it's contingency, risk transfer, all of those things that we know, the layers in which we put in our fragmented industry, all contribute to this horrendous amount of waste that we have. Effectively, half of everything we do is non-value add, and we should be really focused on that, because actually the idea of value redistribution and the concept of disintermediation are going to increasingly play a role going forward. And apologies if David Rockhill covered this in the preceding session. I wasn't able to listen in, so I'm not sure if I'm repeating what David covered from his the excellent Next Normal report McKinsey have done. But this graphic really puts that disintermediation and value redistribution in context. What you see here is the development process. So along the top there, you see the process flow from development, land, design into construction, through to contracting on site or off site. And what you effectively see is the prognosis from McKinsey is a massive shift in value add from traditional processes to new processes, in particular off-site construction. So that purple bar there you see towards the right, 20-30%, is effectively value being shifted from what are currently traditional site-based analog processes into a manufacturing environment. And over on the far right, what you see is not just the 20-30% of value shift, you see 15-20% of the industry where value is up for grabs, where waste and inefficiency is going to be rooted out and effectively becomes an opportunity for increased margin or distribution back to clients for cheaper projects. So, you know, that 20% of a £130 billion industry, rough and tough, which is what we are, that's £25 billion worth of waste to go after. For the industry to understand how it gets some of that, stops looking at low margin opportunities, starts creating margin from efficiency and waste reduction and productivity improvement, rather than just passing on issues for the clients, when in reality, the clients will not wear that in this economic climate. It's impossible now to put prices up in an environment where the clients and markets are also disrupted. And just to add to that McKinsey backdrop, this is another graphic I like to use, which is about the opportunity of technology further disrupting our market. So I'm quite keen to understand the concept of workflow automation. You know, BIM, if you look at where BIM has gone, and we've gone on a big journey with BIM, unfortunately, some of the blockers to widespread adoption of BIM and its benefits case have been the human element of BIM, because BIM is not just software, it's about a process and a behavior of common data environment and application. And where it seems to be going wrong is people, unfortunately. So every bit of the process you can automate or you can augment using technology creates an opportunity to overcome those issues and to really disintermediate in the terms that I've already used. And this pretty complex, this spider's web diagram shows the ecosystems that McKinsey identified back in 2018. Talks about supply chain, digital marketplaces, artificial intelligence and data analytics, modularization, offsite manufacturing, robotics, and the idea of digital twins. And where I see things really starting to take off is when all of those things start getting connected through technology. And we're starting to see some of that happen now, the real game-changing technology that's going to move us forward. And also, in addition to that, I do a lot of work in looking at the concept of pre-manufactured value. So a lot of people default MMC to mean modular construction, and it's a hell of a lot more than that. The graphic at the top there you see is the MHCLG MMC definition framework, 7 categories of MMC formally defined, ranging from category 1, which is volumetric modular, all the way through to category 7, which is site-based digital processes. And the interesting thing is, to increase your pre-manufactured value, you can use a whole combination of different approaches there in different ways. It's not just about moving to off-site. Usually it is, but it's also the augmentation of that with other methods as well, and different methods of using manufacturing. Just moving on to where the industry is at the moment around carrots and sticks, the push and the pull. The last 4 or 5 years has probably seen a relatively unprecedented level of report writing, policy interventions, things that actually have focused on the construction industry perhaps in a way we haven't seen before, all the way through to the post-COVID CLC roadmap to recovery. I think that's a good thing. You know, our industry has often been overlooked by government and policymakers. I think there is definitely a recognition now that the industry is recognised as being an economic powerhouse, and it's going to be really important post-COVID. And if you think about that, and now in the context of some of the macro issues, societal issues now sweeping over us, we've now got a fairly unique situation where quantity and quality have actually coincided in terms of political thinking. So we've got this drive towards safer buildings that no doubt was covered in the previous session. We've got a drive towards better quality and consumer protections. We have a drive towards decarbonising what we build and how we build it. We have a drive towards competency, increased competency and better skills and assurance. And now we also have a drive towards a revised planning system that could actually work and to enable and to facilitate more innovation. And even and particularly post-COVID, we have this plethora of headlines here, some from only the last few days and weeks, talking about how government is going to turn the gas up on use of MMC as part of its policy levers, whether that's direct commissioning, so at the bottom, the reference to prisons and school building and hospital building, or whether actually it's the more difficult area of injecting innovation and modern methods of construction into house building, which is it's a tougher ask because it's a fragmented market. And we also have, on the stick side of things, we had this concern that actually the industry is going to become more and more transparent. We've had a fairly opaque industry over the years, and we're going to see more areas where we get rated and measured. So at the moment, whether it's the Build UK payment performance league tables, or actually it's the beginnings of a TripAdvisor culture coming to development, new residential developments like the Home Views platform that was launched a few months ago, you're going to start seeing some uncomfortable experiences for those that can't deliver quality, that can't deliver good consumer outcomes. So I'm very much of the opinion we're moving to a different culture, and it's one that the Australians, and I reference this work here from New South Wales, where the building commissioner, David Chandler, someone I know pretty well, who's going out to clean up the Australian industry, certainly in New South Wales, is looking to use a rating system as a proxy for who gets what work going forward, who can get what insurance. And when you start to look at that as a real stick to drive behaviour, it starts to have impact. And just moving on to barriers to change, let's not underestimate, we have some significant hurdles to overcome if we're going to inject modern methods and innovation into our industry. We need to think about procurement in a very different way. No doubt this might have already been covered. We need to aggregate the market in a very different way. We need to integrate our processes in a much more progressive way. And we need to think about value, not cost. And these two graphics here on the left, you see the reference to the Construction Innovation Hub value toolkit, which I think is an important step forward in terms of injecting balanced scorecard thinking. And on the right, you see a reference to a report that I co-authored and published 3 weeks ago, Build Homes, Build Jobs, Build Innovation, which set out the challenge for MMC in a highly fragmented market where manufacturers are unable to connect at scale with the buyers of their products, developers and contractors. And the only way forward is either to vertically integrate as an end-to-end developer, manufacturer, contractor, or to aggregate the market at scale, which is a really complex thing to do. And we also need to really face into some of these vested interests and mindset issues we have in the industry, whether it's architects being nervous about the move to offsite and MMC, seeing it as a potential threat to their design creativity or their work scope, which I truly don't believe it is, or whether it's some of the really negative and probably counterproductive material sector lobbying that goes on, that's polarizing a debate between timber and combustibility and carbon and the use of steel and concrete. We really need to, rather than be destructive, we need to be constructive about how we address all of these challenges. We have to address them all. There's no two ways about that, whether it's fire safety, whether it's carbon, whether it's designing differently, but let's do it in a constructive way. And we're making progress when it comes to the financing and insurance of innovative construction techniques. There has been, for a long time, been some big problems with getting funding and mortgage finance and building insurance. That's starting to ease as we get new accreditation systems coming forward. And also, again, I would point to our Antipodean colleagues as being exponents of where they're leading the world. So the New Zealand government has actually driven its building regulation system to positively incentivize manufactured solutions. What it's recognized is the method is as important as the theoretical outcomes of performance. If you're looking to do factory assured processes and you can get those factory processes accredited and validated, then actually the New Zealand building regs will actually give you a benefit for doing that in terms of accelerated building control sign-off. And we also urgently need to be thinking about our skills and competencies. The way in which we change curricula, the way in which we change both higher and further education, technical training, vocational training is really tough. And I know this from my own experiences of being a board member of Moby, which is George Clark's charity. We just don't have enough ways in which to put forward innovation in skills and training to blend the current with the future. And if you look at some of the problems that have been encountered where innovators have really tried to go out on point, like Berkeley, for instance, Berkeley Modular have had to create their own training program from scratch fighting the system rather than with the system in many respects. And we only have one signed off apprenticeship standard for modern methods of construction, which is that one on the bottom right you see there. The only trailblazer that's been signed off that's really about MMC in the whole suite of standards that have been approved. So, I'd summarize by saying there's some great opportunity out there, but there's also some great risk. And that modernise or die challenge that I set out in 2016, for me, is more relevant than ever before. And it's important that all businesses, all organizations, and the leaders of those businesses think long and hard about what path they want to follow, because unfortunately COVID is going to accelerate the difference between future-proofing your business and being successful in the future, or coming to an untimely end in terms of failure. And that's a difficult message for many to understand, particularly in the current climate where things are going to be tough. The whole survivalist instinct will kick in, but the reality is that is what we're going to see, I have no doubt. And I'd urge everyone to be responsible in their thinking, to think about the longer term wherever possible, to act as a leader in whatever shape or form they are, and to collaborate in moving our industry forward. So thank you for listening. I'm looking forward to taking part in questions at the end of this panel session. Thank you.
Fantastic, Mark. Thank you. We're just waiting for Anne to join us. So if I could just ask a couple of questions of you before we move on to the panel.
Sure.
It's fantastic. It's almost as if we put this together with a plan. That link into CIH, we're going to hear tomorrow from Jill Kelleher about the quality plan. And we've already heard from both this drive to MMC, offsite, modular. Where would somebody start? So because I am an architect, if I want to go from designing in a traditional way to designing with modular, where do I start?
So I think the key thing about designing for manufacture and assembly, to coin a phrase, DFMA, it's an important element of the mindset that you need to have as a designer, as a specifier. And inherently what that involves is early engagement with the supply chain. So this whole issue we have, and coming back to procurement and the way in which our industry has shaped itself, and the procurement mechanisms act as a barrier and is splitting the whole idea of design from manufacturer and constructor-led input into the design process. The only way MMC works, particularly as you go up the categories into sort of full volumetric and panelized system design of whole structures, is to have that design process running parallel to alignment to a manufacturing supply chain. So, at the moment, we have lots of different systems out there doing different things. And I know all about platform design and PDFMA, and there's obviously going to be a move towards that, particularly with government direct assets. But architects and engineers, the more they can do their market research, the more they can just go out in the market, go and visit some factories, go and understand how these things are put together, get yourself comfortable around technical accreditation. Absolutely vital that the MMC market is quality led. What we don't want is a free-for-all where we store up legacy issues for the future. It has to be about technical accreditation, which is why I'm so pleased that we're starting to see real collaboration amongst the warranty providers like NHBC and BLP, LABC, Premier Guarantee. They're all talking to each other about the MMC accreditation process, which is vital if we're going to actually build confidence.
And that's all of the things that could be barriers to new ways of working being knocked down, so we can show that this is actually a really easy way of doing it. And as you put in your presentation, it will drive efficiency and productivity at the same time. But what does that mean for the players who are operating in that traditional manufacturers, for example? How should manufacturers approach this if they're doing just one product as part of a system?
So I think this is an opportunity as much as a threat for everyone on that value chain that you saw on the McKinsey graphic. So whether it is construction product manufacturers, whether it's builders merchants, everyone's potentially under threat if you do nothing. What you have to do is react to the market pressures. And I think for building suppliers and for construction products manufacturers, there is great opportunity to look at how you increase your pre-manufactured value. So I get approached by a lot of building product houses that are looking to increase their PMV by looking at augmentation. So rather than just using a raw material product, they're actually looking to combine different configurations of materials and products into mini sub-assemblies or things that they can actually do as part of their manufacturing in a fairly straightforward way, but actually offer something different. Take the man hours out of the site process. That's the key challenge you're looking to do. And as a building, and the manufacturers have a great opportunity to influence that. It doesn't mean that they all have to become, bathroom pod specialists or panelized manufacturers. It doesn't mean that. There's a whole tier down from that. And the same applies for builders merchants. The McKinsey graphic shows materials distribution being a potential threat of being disintermediated because manufacturers will start to step into that space. But I think, again, I've been approached by big builders merchants looking to innovate, looking to face that challenge, and being progressive around how they actually are offering different solutions.
That is absolutely perfect, because that ties together all of the things we've heard so far around innovation and transformation with real tangible ways forward. So thank you for that, Mark. I know you're going to come back onto the panel a little bit later. So everybody, if you've got questions, please do put the questions up onto the chat.